My name's Anna Bushan, and I'm a lecturer in Cardiff School of Art and Design. So my background, professional background, is as an illustrator. So I'm an artist, and I teach a creative subject. And I'm also a long-term meditator and teacher of meditation. And so recently, I've been starting to kind of bring my work as a lecturer in art and design together with my work as a teacher of meditation, and I've been running courses for my students. And so the research that I'm doing is really focusing on that. I do a lot of other teaching outside of the university in which I teach, teaching breath awareness meditation. But I thought today it'd probably be good to focus on the work that I do with the students in the art school.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And maybe if you can explain a bit how you were inspired to use the mindfulness work with them.
Yeah. So the practice that I teach the students is awareness of the breath, of the uncontrolled natural breath. And we also teach, I also practice a loving kindness meditation with them. And we have a lot of kind of discussion around those practices too. And I also talk to them about the kind of ethical underpinnings of the practice. That's a really important part of the sessions that I work on with them. So my inspiration, really, my starting point for teaching them is it's come from a few different kinds of intentions. One is really for my own practice and feeling, I think anybody that feels a great sense of kind of benefit and gratitude for their own practice and for the technique, there's a kind of natural tendency to want to share it with other people. So I think, that was part of my motivation. But in particular, with the students that I work with, they're undergraduate students, and I noticed that there were kind of cycles of anxiety, demotivation, low self-esteem, creative block that were happening quite frequently with students, and was obviously affecting their lives, affecting their experience of being at university, which should be a really positive time and a time of transformation. But I felt at times that there was more work that we could do as academic staff to support their learning journey in a more holistic way, and really understand this relationship between their learning experience and their creative practice and their mental, emotional health and well-being, and really starting to understand the relationship between those different, with creativity, the state of mind that we bring to our work is really important. It's very, in fact, in a lot of the interviews that I've been doing with the students, they're commenting on how difficult it is to be creative when you're feeling anxious. So I suppose my starting point for teaching meditation to them in the context of the art school was to help them to kind of manage this relationship between how they're feeling, how they're approaching their work, the kind of attitude that they bring to their work, and how easily they are finding it to be creative. I mean, in an art school, we're asking our students to be creative every day, which is quite a challenge at times. And so I think it's part of a way of looking at kind of strategies to help them to manage their creativity in a way that feels really positive for them, and hopefully takes them in a kind of upward spiral of good mental health and well-being and motivation and creative flow, as opposed to creative block. Being able to manage anxiety, but beyond managing anxiety, I think it's really about looking at the ways that this practice can actually be a really positive influence on the creative process. And I think that's really, I suppose that's what I bring to my teaching. I understand mindfulness as obviously its therapeutic benefits, which are something that the students really value. But above and beyond that, I'm interested in how it can actually be a really positive influence on people's experience of being creative.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that. And I would like to ask you if during this process in which you have been implementing mindfulness and these meditation practices, have you encountered any specific challenge in terms on, the whole process?
There are challenges. I mean, I suppose there's kind of institutional challenges sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of space and, having that kind of support for what we're doing, for what I'm doing with the students. I think that's starting to really grow and develop, and people are beginning to understand much more how this can be something that we can offer the students. That's, I suppose people are starting to kind of understand and trust in what it is. I think at first sometimes there's a little bit of kind of wariness about these kinds of practices. And so in the university, I think there's been a kind of growing level of support to the point now where it's actually being really actively encouraged. But I still think there's challenges, kind of logistical challenges in terms of finding a quiet space to be, kind of getting the word out to the students so that we're not just attracting students who are perhaps the people who would naturally come to a practice like this, but also reaching out to people who it might not occur to them to do something like this until it's presented to them in a particular way or in a particular context. So I'm looking at different ways of making it available to different groups of students, and particularly trying to reach out to those people who might not naturally come to, for example, sign-up sessions that are offered. And I've been talking to the students about that, and they've been giving me ideas about how we can kind of invite more people in to participate. And their feedback's been really helpful. At the moment, the sessions that I run are a mixture of staff and students. So we have also people from, kind of IT services and people that work in the library, and academics and students from all different courses and all different departments and different ages. So it's a really lovely kind of mixture of people, and I want to kind of try to grow that as much as possible. I suppose another challenge perhaps is, I think, sort of on a more fundamental level in terms of teaching the practice, is that I think that the practice is it has the potential to be very transformative. And on that level to also be quite challenging. And I think the practice is intended to be challenging and intended to take us out of our comfort zones. It's about breaking habit patterns of the mind, and I think that can be quite unsettling at times for people, especially when people have a very deep and committed practice, which some of the students do have made a real commitment to the practice. And so I think how we support people to kind of manage that journey, how we can help people to embrace that potential that it has to bring about change, while not finding it destabilizing, I think is a really important conversation that we need to have around mindfulness generally. So I think there are challenges there, but not challenges that are also positive challenges that I think are just about sensitivity in the way that we teach and in the way that we understand the technique and talk about the technique, and the kind of discussions that we have around the experiences that people are having.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think it's a very important Yeah, it's a very important question and should be topicalized in any kind of context in which mindfulness is being taught. And
Yeah.
in that way, I don't know, I may want to ask you if you think that these challenges and how the practice could be that transformative, is it something that you relate to the ethics of the practice
Yeah.
or?
Yeah, it's definitely. I don't think you can separate the ethics from the practice.
Mhm.
So traditionally, the practice was never taught without first the ethics being taught. So it was
Mhm.
all that way round. So the ethics were the kind of foundation on which the practice is built, and in which people can get maximum benefit from the practice. So on a really simple level, the ethics. So for example, the principles of non-violence and truthfulness, and
Okay.
what's called in yoga, it's called yama. In Buddhist traditions, it's called shila.
Mhm.
So those 5 principles are in order to change the habit patterns of the mind at the most kind of external level, and then we move into a subtler level of working with the mind in meditation to bring about a deeper level of transformation. But I think that it's very clear when you go back into the traditions, it's very clear that there's an understanding that really, in order to experience um, in order to realize the potential of the practices, in terms of bringing peace of mind, in terms of balancing the mind, all of those things that we talk about, emotional resilience and cognitive control, and but in terms of that ability to balance the mind and to relax the mind, to bring stability to the mind, um, and also then to work with the mind and to bring about change in its habit patterns, that none of that can really happen if it creates a very turbulent environment if we're trying to, on one hand, work with the mind in that very, very subtle and delicate way, but then on the other hand, we're not understanding the impact of our behavior in terms of those ethical principles and the impact of that behavior on our mind and on our state of mind and on our ability to then work with the mind. So in order to create the right conditions to work with the mind in that quite subtle way, we need to have that understanding, that basic understanding. And I think that is one of the challenges about the tech, in terms of teaching the technique, is sometimes to have those conversations about
Okay.
ethics, because I don't think it's easy. It's not
Yeah.
easy to talk about those things in a way that doesn't feel moralistic or preachy, or that is discursive and all encompassing and non-judgmental. And I think there's many reasons why perhaps many people shy away from really addressing that aspect of the practice when they're teaching. And I think partly it's awkward, and there's other reasons why. But I think it's a challenge that's really worthwhile. And I found with my students, these are students who are in their early 20s, undergraduate students. Um, I I've never I don't think I've ever introduced these ideas to a group of students who don't immediately just understand them and find a lot of sense and wisdom in them, and they're able to talk about them very comfortably. So I think the awkwardness sometimes comes in, as a teacher we might feel the awkwardness on how we address those things, but in my experience actually people are really quite grateful and quite open to actually having an opportunity to talk about those kinds of values that often we don't make space to talk about in our lives, or it's rare actually to have the opportunity to have those kinds of conversations, I think, for our students. And so this is a really a good opportunity, I think, to to kind of have discussions around values and ethical principles. So yeah, I think it is really a really significant part of the way that we teach. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I can see the value of that. And I think, I don't know if you have experienced more difficulties when trying to have these conversations with the staff and the academics rather than with the students. I don't know if you have found any difference on that.
Actually, honestly, I've taught hundreds and hundreds of people over the years, and I've never had anyone who's had a problem with those principles. And
Okay.
I'm just, that's just been my experience. Sometimes when we talk about, you know, there's certain principles that, open up a discussion about what that means within our culture and within our society and within, the contemporary context. But those are all conversations that have felt very positive. So nobody's, even the academic staff, I mean, maybe they might have felt that it was inappropriate, but they
Okay.
didn't say anything to me. But the feeling that I've got is that actually people, and I think it's the way that you talk about it. I think it's the
Yeah.
way that,
Okay.
but yeah, my experience is that people have been absolutely fine with it. It's not we're not asking people to make vows and, to kind of take on a way of living, but I'm putting those ideas out there as part of introducing the technique in context and in its historical context as well. I think it's
Yeah.
really important to acknowledge its historical context and its philosophical context as well. And I suppose, again, coming back to this idea of the challenges, one of the challenges is finding the right balance with that.
Okay.
So being able to, again, it's something that the students have said that they really enjoy and value, is finding out more about the history and the context of the practice. So and finding the right balance with that, so how much we go back into the original teachings that have influenced contemporary kind of models of mindfulness, and how much we can't, it's not the right setting to kind of go into all of that in depth. So finding the right balance, I think, in how much of that we bring into the classes or into the discussion is something that, is it's perhaps a challenge, but something that I think kind of gets worked out through
Yeah.
experience and through
Okay.
working with different groups of people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, yeah, my question was in this direction, how like introducing contemplative practices such as mindfulness really like crashes with our traditional way of teaching, and how also like the teacher is maybe exposed or engaged with the students. And I
Mm.
think having in mind the ethical background in which the mindfulness practice were developed, and bringing that specific context to our classrooms is like very, very important.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I also, I don't necessarily call myself a mindfulness teacher.
Okay.
I that term mindfulness, I don't just use it unthinkingly, because I think it's really important to be clear about what we mean when we use that term, and
Of
also
course.
the associations that people have with it. And so I think I do call it mindful meditation,
Okay.
and I call it awareness of the breath meditation, but I usually describe it as the practice that I teach being rooted in the traditions from which contemporary models of mindfulness arise. So I make a distinction, because I feel that in the way that I teach, I'm going perhaps a step further back, and so I'm drawing on an understanding of those practices that comes from the traditions that informed contemporary movements, mindfulness movements. So I I acknowledge that I'm part of that world of mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
but I also think that within that we perhaps need to be quite clear in how we position ourselves, or we shouldn't assume that. I think there's perhaps a danger of the term mindfulness being almost monopolized by a
Okay.
kind of approach. And the term mindfulness is obviously it's a translation of the Pali word sati, which also is translated sometimes as awareness.
Right.
And so I think it's important. I usually do mention that when I'm teaching as well, so that people understand when we use the term mindfulness, actually what's meant by that. And I try to discuss what the term sati means within the context of the practice, so that we can understand it a bit more.
Okay, thank you very much for expanding this important point. I think it's very, very useful for what we want to share with the audience.
Right.
And yeah, I'm afraid we need to move a little bit to the end of the interview.
Yeah, sure.
But I just wanted to ask you if you would like to share something right now with us, like like a practice or something that the audience can keep like thinking about in their own time.
Let me have a little bit of a think. I'm not going to do a meditation practice.
Right?
So
Perfect.
I won't do the meditation practice in this context, but perhaps there's something that I have a discussion that I've had with my students. So I should maybe say that one of the contexts that I've taught the technique is within the art school. We have an interdisciplinary module, and we have students from all different subjects and courses coming together to work on a live brief. And in this particular project, it's called Tipping Point, and it's about agency for change. And we work with a non-profit organisation. And we're really looking at how, as artists and creative people, we can bring about change in people's behaviour. And in this case, it was in regards to the aims of an environmental charity. So as part of that project, I was teaching meditation, mindful meditation. It was kind of woven into the fabric of the project. And we had a lot of discussion around values, but also about a discussion around change, and discussion around how we understand our sense of responsibility in the world. And I think it might be helpful just to, maybe what I could do is share some of the kind of discussion points that I raised in that course. So, and also there's a quote from a student that I think is quite nice to illustrate one of the things I think that this practice can do in terms of developing a sense of social responsibility, which I know is part of your focus. So I'll just share this quote with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Said, I like how mindfulness was integrated into the sessions, as it really fit with the theme of being aware of oneself within the wider world, recognizing that as artists we can help to move in a certain direction, in this instance with the tide or against the tide of assuming responsibility for our actions. And I think that's just a really lovely statement from a student who's involved in the process of developing greater self-awareness and greater awareness of our sense of responsibility in the world. So I'll share with you this I can just find these discussion points that I raised. So one of the things that we were looking at was the whole idea of stories, and the kind of stories that we that within society that we kind of buy into, and the stories that we tell ourselves and about ourselves and about our place in the world. And there was, the author David Loy has written some really interesting stuff about this, and he used the analogy of stories, us being kind of unaware of the stories that we live in. So like fish that swim in the sea and they're unaware of that they're in the sea and that they're in the water. It's just their environment, that we kind of become unaware of the narratives that are woven around us. I think developing, so in fact I can find a quote by David Loy. So, unaware that our stories are stories, we usually experience them as the world. Like fish that do not see the water they swim in, we normally do not notice the medium we dwell in. We take for granted that the world we experience is just the way things are, but our concepts and ideas about the world, like the stories they're part of, strongly affect our perception of reality. And so we sort of raised this point and discussed. So I asked the students, can we become more aware of the medium in which we swim? And does this kind of awareness help us to make choices about the kind of stories we live by and the kind of changes we make within ourselves and within society? And what are the stories we live by that increase suffering? Which are the stories that decrease suffering? Can awareness help us to have a healthier perspective on how we construct the stories that contribute to our sense of ourself in the world? So, how do we or society construct narratives to justify particular behaviour? So maybe that's an example of some of the discussion that I would have within a kind of more general teaching context, but also connect with the principles of the practice, the ethical principles of the practice, but also that sense of the practice of developing greater awareness, greater sati. So maybe that's just a way of kind of understanding how these different elements are woven together.